For years, Clive Woodward was seen as one of rugby's most outspoken figures. Some admired his honesty. Others believed he complained too much. Whether people agreed with him or not, one thing was impossible to deny. He never kept his opinions to himself. As the coach who guided England to Rugby World Cup glory in 2003, Woodward became one of the most influential voices the sport had ever produced. Success gave his words weight, and he used that platform often. He questioned referees. He challenged rugby's governing bodies. He criticized rival coaches. Sometimes, he was praised for saying what others were afraid to say. Other times, he was accused of creating unnecessary controversy. But those who followed his career closely knew something important. Woodward rarely picked fights without a reason. Behind almost every public criticism was a rivalry that had been building for years, a disagreement over how rugby should be played, or a belief that someone had crossed a line he simply could not accept. While rugby has always promoted respect between opponents, that respect did not always extend beyond the final whistle. Over the course of more than 3 decades in the game, Woodward encountered countless players, coaches, referees, and administrators. Many earned his admiration. Some became trusted colleagues. A select few became the source of frustrations that lasted for years. These were not disagreements that disappeared after one difficult afternoon. They resurfaced again and again through newspaper interviews, post-match press conferences, World Cup campaigns, and heated debates about the future of rugby itself. Some of the names on this list may surprise you. Others became so closely linked with Woodward that every meeting seemed destined to create another headline. From fierce coaching rivalries to bitter disputes over officiating, these are the 5 rugby people who, more than anyone else, found themselves on the wrong side of Clive Woodward. Number 5. Warren Gatland. By the time Warren Gatland became one of the most successful coaches in international rugby, Clive Woodward had already established himself as a man who believed preparation won matches long before kickoff. Every detail mattered. Fitness analysis, psychology, and discipline were all part of the same blueprint. Gatland, however, approached the game with a very different style, and it didn't take long for the two men to develop a relationship built more on tension than mutual admiration. Unlike many coaches who preferred to keep their opinions behind closed doors, Gatland never seemed afraid to speak before a major fixture. In the build-up to matches involving England, particularly during his years with Wales, he regularly made comments that dominated newspaper headlines. Sometimes they questioned England's mentality. Other times, they challenged the quality of individual players or suggested that England had been given advantages other nations did not enjoy. To many supporters, it was simply part of the psychological battle that exists in elite sport. Woodward saw something different. He believed those comments were carefully designed to influence the atmosphere around a match before either team had stepped onto the pitch. In his view, too much attention was being placed on creating headlines rather than allowing the rugby to speak for itself. He had never objected to confidence. He had built an England side overflowing with belief. But there was a difference, at least in his eyes, between confidence and calculated provocation. Their disagreement was never about one interview or one tournament. It reflected 2 completely different ideas about leadership. Woodward preferred meticulous planning and constant innovation behind the scenes. Gatland embraced confrontation whenever he believed it could give his team even the slightest psychological edge. Neither man was willing to change simply because the other disagreed. The rivalry never became openly hostile in the way some sporting feuds do, but there was little warmth between them. Every fresh comment, every tournament meeting, and every media appearance seemed to reinforce the impression that these were 2 powerful personalities who viewed rugby through entirely different lenses. Even years later, whenever Woodward discussed coaches who frustrated him the most, Gatland's name was never far from the conversation. Number 4. Steve Walsh. Few subjects irritated Clive Woodward more consistently than refereeing, and few referees attracted more of his public criticism than Steve Walsh. Walsh was regarded by many as one of the game's most confident officials. He never lacked authority and was rarely afraid to make a big decision under pressure. That confidence won him plenty of admirers, but it also created critics who believed he sometimes became too involved in the contest itself. Woodward was one of them. Several high-profile internationals left the England coach questioning not only individual decisions, but the overall consistency of the officiating. While every coach complains after a difficult defeat, Woodward went further than most. He repeatedly argued that elite rugby expected players and coaches to improve every season, yet referees were often protected from the same level of scrutiny. His comments were rarely aimed at one penalty or one controversial moment. Instead, he believed there was a wider problem. According to Woodward, the sport had become reluctant to acknowledge mistakes made by match officials. When players made errors, they faced criticism from supporters, journalists, and coaches. When coaches made poor decisions, they were judged by results. But referees, in his opinion, operated within a system that too often defended its own. That belief inevitably brought Steve Walsh into the spotlight. Walsh's commanding style frequently divided opinion, and whenever one of his decisions became the main talking point after a test match, Woodward was rarely shy about expressing his frustration. Those comments created headlines across the rugby world and fueled an ongoing debate about whether coaches should publicly criticize officials at all. To Woodward, remaining silent would have been the easier option. But he believed silence solved nothing. His repeated criticism was never presented as a personal attack on Walsh's character. Instead, it reflected a conviction that the game's biggest matches deserved the highest possible standard of officiating and that accountability should apply to everyone involved. Unfortunately for Steve Walsh, he became one of the referees most closely associated with that argument, turning a professional disagreement into one of the most persistent rivalries of Woodward's coaching career. Number 3. Graham Henry. If Clive Woodward measured himself against anyone during the early years of England's rise, it was Graham Henry. Henry wasn't just another international coach. He represented New Zealand rugby, the standard by which almost every other nation judged itself. Long before the two men found themselves on opposite sides of major test matches, both were trying to answer the same question: what would rugby's next great team look like? Their answers were very different. Woodward embraced sports science specialist coaching, performance analysis, and marginal gains years before many national teams did. England became one of the most professionally prepared sides in the world, with every detail planned in advance. Henry, meanwhile, believed just as strongly in New Zealand's traditional strengths. Skilled decision-making and an instinctive understanding of the game remained at the heart of his philosophy. While he also welcomed innovation, he often suggested that no amount of technology could replace rugby intelligence developed over a lifetime. Those contrasting beliefs naturally fueled comparisons. Whenever England and New Zealand met, the conversation extended far beyond the players on the field. Journalists repeatedly framed the matches as a contest between two coaching philosophies. Every press conference was examined for subtle jabs. Every post-match interview analyzed for hidden criticism. Woodward never hid his belief that England deserved more respect than it often received from the Southern Hemisphere. He felt that many within New Zealand rugby viewed England's success as temporary, dismissing it as the product of money and preparation rather than genuine excellence. Whether that perception was entirely fair is still debated. But it shaped how Woodward viewed many of his encounters with Henry. Neither man engaged in constant personal attacks, yet there was an unmistakable edge whenever they discussed each other's teams. Respect existed because both had achieved extraordinary success, but friendship never truly developed. For Woodward, Henry came to symbolize an establishment that often underestimated England's achievements, making every victory over New Zealand feel about more than just the final score. Their rivalry wasn't driven by hatred in the traditional sense. It was driven by two elite coaches who believed their vision of rugby was the one the sport should follow, and neither was prepared to admit the other might be right. Number 2. Bernard Leaport. There are rivalries built on decades of history, and then there are rivalries made even more intense by the personalities involved. Clive Woodward's relationship with Bernard Leaport combined both. England against France has never needed extra motivation. Every meeting in the Six Nations carried its own weight, with pride, history, and expectation hanging over every tackle. But when Woodward and Leaport occupied the two coaching boxes, the contest often began days before the opening whistle. Neither man enjoyed giving away even the smallest psychological advantage. Leaport had a reputation for speaking his mind before major matches. He questioned selections, commented on opponents, and rarely avoided controversial topics if he believed they might unsettle the other side. The French media loved it, and the British press eagerly repeated every quote. Woodward was never convinced those comments were innocent. He believed Leaport understood exactly how to create pressure before a test match, not only on England's players but also on match officials and public opinion. In Woodward's eyes, it was another example of using the media as part of the tactical battle, rather than allowing events on the pitch to decide the story. Their personalities only widened the gap. Woodward approached coaching with structure preparation and relentless attention to detail. Leaport was more emotional, more instinctive, and often appeared comfortable, embracing the chaos that surrounded elite rugby. Each believed his own approach gave his team the best chance of success, leaving very little room for agreement. The tension occasionally spilled into post-match interviews, where both men defended their players with equal determination. Compliments were rare. Public disagreements were not. Even when England and France were no longer meeting with World Cup dreams on the line, neither coach seemed interested in rewriting the history between them. There was respect for what the other had achieved, but respect did not erase years of frustration. For Woodward, Bernard Leaport represented more than a fierce opponent. He represented a style of leadership that clashed with his own at almost every level, making each encounter feel like another chapter in a rivalry that neither man was eager to end. Number 1. Paddy O'Brien. Unlike the other names on this list, Paddy O'Brien was never standing on the opposite touchline as a rival coach or blowing the whistle in the middle of a test match. Yet no one came to symbolize Clive Woodward's frustrations with professional rugby more than the man responsible for overseeing its referees. For years, Woodward argued that the sport had created an imbalance. Players were analyzed after every performance. Coaches were judged by every result. But when referees made costly mistakes, meaningful accountability seemed far more difficult to find. That criticism inevitably brought him into conflict with O'Brien, who, as the head of international referee development and appointments, became the public face of the officiating system. Woodward never claimed refereeing was an easy job. He acknowledged that officials had to make split-second decisions under enormous pressure. What he questioned was the culture surrounding those decisions. Too often he believed controversial calls disappeared without explanation, while coaches and players were left to deal with the consequences. His frustration became increasingly public. Through newspaper columns, television appearances, and interviews, Woodward repeatedly called for greater transparency. He wanted referees to explain key decisions to be reviewed more openly and to face the same level of professional scrutiny expected of everyone else involved in elite rugby. Those comments were not always welcomed. Many within rugby felt Woodward was placing unfair pressure on officials. Others believed he was simply making excuses after disappointing performances. O'Brien consistently defended the integrity of the refereeing program, insisting that officials were constantly assessed and held to high standards. Neither side backed down. As the years passed, their disagreement grew beyond individual matches. It became a debate about how the professional game should be governed. Woodward saw openness and accountability as essential if rugby wanted to keep improving. O'Brien represented a system that believed confidence in referees was best protected by handling most reviews behind closed doors. That fundamental difference in philosophy ensured the relationship never truly recovered. Unlike a rivalry based on one controversial afternoon, this was built over years of public criticism, conflicting beliefs, and repeated disagreements about the future of the sport. If there was one person who embodied everything Clive Woodward believed rugby needed to change, it was Paddy O'Brien. That is why, more than anyone else, he occupies the top spot on this list. Clive Woodward has never claimed to be an easy man to agree with. Throughout his career, he challenged players, questioned referees, criticized administrators, and openly disagreed with rival coaches. Those habits earned him both loyal supporters and outspoken critics, often at the very same time. Looking back, it's clear that many of these rivalries were never truly personal in the traditional sense. They were born from fundamentally different beliefs about how rugby should be played, coached, and governed. Woodward has always argued that success means very little if people become afraid to question the system. Whether discussing officiating, preparation, leadership, or the direction of the professional game, he consistently chose to speak publicly rather than remain silent. That approach inevitably created enemies along the way. Some would say he crossed the line too often. Others would argue rugby needed more people willing to challenge the status quo. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What cannot be denied is that every name on this list represents a chapter in one of the most outspoken careers the sport has ever seen. These weren't simply moments of anger. They reflected deeper disagreements that shaped some of the biggest stories in modern rugby, influencing debates that continued long after the final whistle had blown. Even today, Clive Woodward remains one of rugby's most recognizable voices. His opinions still divide supporters, just as they did during his coaching career. Perhaps that's exactly why his legacy continues to provoke discussion. Not because everyone agreed with him, but because he was never afraid to say what he believed, regardless of who was standing on the other side.